There are certain mistakes that don't feel like mistakes when you're making them. They feel like realism, like self-protection, like the reasonable response to an unreasonable world. But if you've been studying Stoicism for any length of time, reading Marcus, working through Epictetus, returning to the same passages again and again, and you still find yourself reacting the same way, losing the same battles, repeating the same patterns, then the problem isn't your knowledge. It's that your mind has automated the wrong responses, and it keeps running them, not because you're weak, but because you've never interrupted them at the right moment. These are the 9 mistakes that keep that automation in place. Each one has a precise point where it can be broken, not with more philosophy, not with more willpower, but with a specific act of awareness that stops the pattern before it completes. If you recognize yourself in even 3 of these, this video will change how you move through your days. Mistake 1. Seeking comfort over clarity. Every morning, before anything real has happened, your mind is already making a quiet decision. Not consciously, not deliberately, but the pull is there, toward what feels safe, what confirms what you already believe, what doesn't require you to look too closely at what's actually going on. This is the first mistake. Not laziness, not ignorance. The deliberate, unconscious choice of comfort over an honest account of where you actually are. And it costs more than most people realize, because the gap between where you think you are and where you actually are, that gap is where bad decisions live. It's where the wrong relationships persist, where the wrong work continues, where months become years without meaningful change. Think about what that actually looks like in a day. You know the project isn't going the way it should, but instead of sitting with that uncomfortable truth, you focus on the parts that are working. You know the relationship has something unresolved in it, but the conversation feels too costly right now, so you defer it. You know your mornings are undisciplined, but you frame it as rest, as recovery, as something you'll address next week when things settle. None of these feel like mistakes in the moment. They feel like reasonable judgments, like a man managing his energy wisely. But what they are, underneath the reasonable framing, is a systematic preference for the feeling of being okay over the truth of what is actually happening. And here is what makes this particular mistake so damaging over time. Comfort compounds. Every time you choose the softer account of your situation, the gap between your map and the actual terrain widens slightly. And a slightly wrong map, used every day for a year, will take you somewhere you never intended to go. Epictetus was direct about this. It's not what happens to you that shapes your life. It's what you tell yourself about what's happening. And if what you're telling yourself is softened, edited, made comfortable, then you are navigating by a map that doesn't match the terrain. The Stoics did not confuse self-compassion with self-deception. Marcus Aurelius, in the privacy of his own journal, was relentlessly precise about his failures. Not cruel, not punishing, but honest in a way that most people reserve only for their enemies. He looked at himself clearly because he understood that the alternative, a comfortable fiction about who he was, would cost him the very thing he was trying to build. And this is the distinction that matters here. Clarity is not the same as self-criticism. It is not the voice that tells you that you are failing, that you are behind, that you are not enough. That voice is just another form of distortion, just as inaccurate as the voice that tells you everything is fine. Clarity is simply the willingness to see what is actually there, without softening it, without dramatizing it, without immediately reaching for an explanation that makes it more bearable. The Stoic corrective isn't harshness, it's precision. Once a day, not once a week, not when things go wrong. Ask yourself one question. What am I avoiding seeing right now? Not to punish yourself, but to close the gap before it widens. You don't need to fix what you find, not immediately, but you need to see it. Because the mind that sees clearly, even when what it sees is uncomfortable, is the mind that can actually respond to its life rather than manage the story it tells about it. Clarity is uncomfortable for about 30 seconds. Confusion is uncomfortable for years. Mistake 2, reacting before reflecting. You know this mistake. You've probably known it for years. Someone sends a message that didn't sit well with you. A colleague undermines you in a meeting. Your partner says something in a tone that hits a nerve. And before any conscious thought has formed, you're already responding from the part of you that hasn't read a single page of philosophy. The mind that reacts is not your mind. It's the automated version, the one that was built before you started asking better questions. The one that learned, somewhere early in life, that speed was safety. That responding quickly meant you were in control. That hesitation was weakness. And that learning has never been updated. It's still running. Every time something hits a nerve, the automated version steps forward. And the version of you that understands Epictetus steps back. What makes this mistake so persistent isn't that people don't know about the pause. Most people who have spent any time with Stoicism have encountered the idea, the gap between stimulus and response, the moment where choice lives. They've read it. They've nodded at it. They may have even explained it to someone else, but knowing about the pause and having access to it under real pressure are two entirely different things. Because under pressure, when the message lands wrong, when the tone hits the nerve, when the room shifts against you, the automated version doesn't ask for permission. It simply moves. And by the time the philosophical version of you has arrived, the reaction has already happened. This is why Marcus Aurelius returned to this idea so consistently in his private writing. Not because it was new to him, but because he kept failing it. A man running the largest empire in the world, with every reason to react quickly and decisively, reminding himself daily that the pause was not hesitation, that it was not weakness, that the moment between what happens and what you do next was not a delay. It was the only place where his actual character could operate. The reactive response feels decisive. It feels strong. It feels like a man who knows his own mind. But strength that cannot pause is not strength. It is automation wearing the costume of confidence. And here is what the reactive mind costs you that most people don't account for. It's not just the immediate damage of the wrong response. It's the hours that follow, the replay, the reconstruction of what you should have said, the low-grade friction that sits in your chest for the rest of the day, because you always know, that the automated version of you showed up instead of the real one. That cost is paid every single time. And it compounds the same way comfort does, quietly, consistently, sawed in a direction you didn't choose. The Stoic corrective is not complicated, but it requires practice in low-stakes situations before it becomes available in high-stakes ones. When something hits, a message, a comment, a moment of friction, don't respond for 60 seconds. Not to think of the perfect reply, not to construct the ideal counter, just to notice what the automated version of you was about to do. That noticing is the interruption. And the interruption, practiced in small moments, becomes accessible in larger ones. Not immediately, not reliably at first, but over time, something begins to shift. The pause stops feeling like restraint and starts feeling like the most powerful move available. Because the gap between stimulus and response is not empty space. It is where your character lives. It is where every value you hold, and every principle you've studied, every version of yourself you're trying to build. It is where all of that either shows up or doesn't. Most people never find it, But once you do, you cannot unfind it. And that is the beginning of something that no reaction, however decisive it felt, could ever build. Mistake 3. Outsourcing your peace. There is a version of this mistake that's easy to spot. The person who needs constant approval, who checks their phone every few minutes waiting for a response that will tell them where they stand, who cannot sit with uncertainty about what someone thinks of them for longer than an hour without it beginning to affect how they move through the rest of their day. That version is easy to identify because it's visible. It has obvious symptoms. And most people who have spent any time with Stoicism have already done enough work to move past the most obvious expression of it. But there's a subtler version. And it's the one that catches people who know better. It's tying your internal state to outcomes you cannot control. The presentation that goes well and leaves you feeling grounded and capable. The one that doesn't and leaves you rattled for the rest of the week. The project that gains traction and gives you a quiet confidence. The one that stalls and takes something from you that you can't quite name. The relationship that's stable and gives you solid ground beneath your feet. The one that's uncertain and removes that ground entirely, leaving you trying to function from a place that no longer feels steady. This is outsourced peace, and it looks almost identical to normal life until you notice that your stability is only ever borrowed, that it depends on circumstances behaving themselves, that on the days when external things align, you are calm and clear and capable, and on the days when they don't, you are a different person entirely. Most people accept this as the human condition, as the natural rhythm of a life that involves real stakes and real outcomes. But Epictetus drew a line here with surgical precision, and he did not draw it gently. Some things are in your control, most things are not. Your opinions, your impulses, your desires, your responses, these are yours. Everything else, outcomes, other people's behavior, circumstances, results, these are not. And the degree to which your peace depends on the second category is the exact degree to which you are not free. Not partially free. Not mostly free with some exceptions. Not free. This is the Stoic position. And it is not comfortable to sit with, honestly. Because when you look at a typical day, really look at it, you begin to notice how much of your internal state is being determined by things that were never in your control to begin with. The email that arrives with a certain tone, the meeting that runs over, the plan that doesn't hold, the person who responds differently than you expected. Each one small, each one on its own, manageable. But together, across a full day, they are making decisions about your internal state that you never consciously authorized. And here is what makes this mistake so hard to interrupt. It doesn't feel like weakness. It feels like engagement, like caring about your life, like being a person who takes things seriously. The man who is unaffected by outcomes can look, from the outside, like someone who doesn't care. And caring about your work, your relationships, your direction, is not the problem. The problem is the location of your foundation, whether it is built on something internal and therefore stable, or on something external and therefore always conditional. Marcus ran an empire. He was not detached from outcomes. He made decisions every day that determined whether people lived or died, whether borders held, whether institutions survived. The stakes were not abstract, but he understood that his response to any outcome was always his, that the ground beneath him was internal, not circumstantial, that his peace was not a reward for things going well. It was a practice he returned to regardless of whether they did. That distinction between caring about outcomes and depending on them is the entire corrective. The practice is simple and uncomfortable in equal measure. At the end of each day, identify one moment where your internal state shifted because of something external. Not to judge yourself for it. Not to perform detachment you don't yet feel. Just to see it. To name it precisely. To acknowledge that in that moment, something outside you was making a decision about something inside you, and that you let it. That seeing is not the solution, but it is the beginning of one. Because you cannot reclaim ground you haven't noticed you've given away. And most people are giving it away every day in small increments without ever stopping to notice that it's happening. Your peace is not a circumstance, but it is a practice. And it begins with refusing, one moment at a time, to let the outside world be the one that decides how the inside one feels. If this is landing, if you're recognizing these patterns in yourself and you want to go deeper, consider subscribing. This channel exists for exactly the person this video is built for. Not the person looking for motivation that fades by Friday, but the person who wants a practice that actually holds. Mistake 4. Confusing motion with progress. You are busy, almost certainly. The days are full. The list keeps growing. There is always something that needs a response, a decision, an hour of focused attention. Oh, and from the outside, and often from the inside too, it looks like a life being lived with intention, with effort, with the kind of consistent engagement that should, by any reasonable measure, be producing results. But if you stop long enough to look honestly at the direction of all that movement, not the volume of it, not the effort behind it, but the actual direction, something uncomfortable begins to surface. The movement is real, but the progress isn't. Emails get answered, but the important conversation keeps getting deferred. Tasks get completed, but the work that actually matters stays untouched at the bottom of the list. Meetings happen, plans get made, days pass with a genuine sense of engagement. And yet, at the end of the week, the distance between where you are and where you intended to be hasn't closed. In some cases, it's widened. This is the mistake, not laziness. Laziness is easier to diagnose and easier to correct. This is something more sophisticated. It is the mind's preference for the available task over the important one, for the motion that feels productive over the direction that actually is. And the reason it persists is that motion has a feeling, a genuine one. The inbox at 0, the list with items crossed off, the day that was full from morning to evening. These produce a real sense of accomplishment, a neurological signal that something was done, that effort was expended, that the day was not wasted. The mind registers this as progress, but the mind, in this case, is wrong. Seneca named this trap with a precision that still stings 2,000 years later. It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a great deal of it. And the waste he was describing wasn't idleness, it was misdirected effort. The life spent moving in every direction except the one that mattered. Think about what this actually costs over time. A day of motion without progress is recoverable. A week is manageable. But a year of confusing the two, a year of full days that moved nothing forward, is a year of your life that cannot be returned. And the person at the end of that year is not further along than the person at the beginning. They are simply more tired, more frustrated, and more confused about why all that effort produced so little. The Stoics were not opposed to action. Marcus Aurelius was one of the most productive human beings who ever lived by any measurable standard. But he was clear about the distinction between movement and direction, between effort and intention, between the man who is always busy and the man who always knows why. That distinction begins with one question, not a complicated one, not one that requires a long reflection or a strategic planning session. Just this: is this the most important thing available to me right now? Or is it the most available thing? Those two categories look almost identical from the inside. They both feel like work. They both require effort. They both produce the sensation of engagement. But only one of them moves you forward. And the mind, left to its own defaults, will almost always choose the second category. Because the most available thing is easier to start, faster to complete, and more immediately rewarding than the most important thing, which is usually harder, slower, and connected to something that won't pay off until later. The corrective is not a productivity system. It is not a new framework for organizing your tasks or managing your time. It is simpler and more uncomfortable than either of those things. It is the daily practice of asking, before the motion begins, where the motion is going. Not in a grand strategic sense, just for today, just for this hour, just for this one decision about where attention goes next. Because motion without direction is not discipline, it is not engagement, it is not a life being lived with intention. But it is a more sophisticated form of avoidance, one that is harder to interrupt precisely because it feels so much like the real thing. And once you see the difference, you cannot unsee it. The full day that moved nothing forward stops feeling like effort. It starts feeling like what it actually is: the automated mind keeping itself busy, so it doesn't have to do the harder thing. The harder thing is always available. It is almost never urgent, and it is always the one that matters. Mistake 5. Rehearsing grievance. The mind that keeps returning to the wound is not healing it. It is deepening it. You know the replay. The conversation that went wrong. The person who underestimated you. The opportunity that was taken from you unfairly. The moment where someone showed you exactly who they were, and what they showed you wasn't good. It sits somewhere in your chest, unresolved, returning at odd hours without invitation. In the shower, on the commute, in the last few minutes before sleep, when the day has quieted enough for the mind to go looking for something to chew on. And it finds this. Every time. What makes this mistake so hard to interrupt is that it doesn't arrive as a mistake. It arrives as something reasonable, as processing, as the mind doing the necessary work of understanding what happened and deciding what it means. And in the early stages, in the hours immediately after something difficult occurs, that's exactly what it is. The mind needs to move through an experience. That movement is not the problem. The problem begins when the movement stops being forward and becomes circular. When the replay is no longer processing what happened, but rehearsing it, refining it, adding detail, sharpening the injustice, building the case more precisely with each pass, not moving through the experience, returning to it, again and again, with a consistency that would be admirable if it were directed at anything else. Because here is what rehearsal does, and this is the part that most people haven't fully reckoned with. What you rehearse, you strengthen, not metaphorically, neurologically. Every time the mind runs the replay, the neural pathway that connects that experience to that emotional response becomes slightly more established, slightly more automatic, slightly more the default route the mind takes when it has a moment of unstructured time. You are not just remembering what happened, you are training yourself to keep feeling it. Marcus Aurelius wrote from a position of genuine power and still had to remind himself daily not to waste that power on bitterness. Not because the bitterness was unjustified. He was an emperor, surrounded by people with complicated motivations, genuine enemies, and every incentive to undermine him. The grievances were real. But he understood something about the economics of attention that most people never fully absorb. while every moment spent rehearsing what was done to you is a moment not spent deciding what you will do next. And the man who is deciding what to do next is always more powerful than the man who is perfecting his account of what was done to him. This is not a call for forgiveness in the soft, sentimental sense. The Stoics were not sentimental. They did not ask you to pretend that the wrong thing didn't happen, or that the person who acted badly was actually acting well, or that your response to genuine injustice was somehow a character flaw. None of that is what's being asked here. What's being asked is simpler and harder than forgiveness. It is redirection. Premeditatio malorum, the Stoic practice of anticipating difficulty before it arrives, is usually taught as a forward tool. You imagine what could go wrong so that when it does, you are not caught unprepared. But there is a backwards application of the same principle that is just as powerful and almost never discussed. When the replay begins, when the mind starts its familiar route back to the wound, ask one question. Not "was this fair?" You already know the answer to that. Not "what should I have said?" That conversation is over. Just this: what does continuing this rehearsal cost me? Not emotionally, concretely. The next hour of your attention, the clarity you need for the work in front of you, the energy that could go towards something you're actually trying to build. Name the cost precisely. Because the mind that is rehearsing grievance is spending something real. And most people are spending it without ever stopping to check the price. The grievance does not need to be resolved to be set down. The wrong does not need to be righted before you are permitted to redirect your attention. It only needs to be seen clearly for what it is. A pattern the mind runs because it hasn't been given a better instruction. You can give it one, not once, with great resolve, in a moment of clarity, but repeatedly, in the small moments when the replay begins, and you notice it beginning, and you choose, not easily, not without resistance, but deliberately, to go somewhere else instead. That choice, made enough times, doesn't erase what happened, but it stops what happened from being the thing that shapes what happens next. And that distinction between a past that informs you and a past that runs you is one of the most important ones a person can make. So mistake 6, performing virtue instead of practicing it. This one is specific to people who have been studying philosophy long enough to be fluent in it. And if you're watching this video, there is a reasonable chance that's you. You know the concepts, not vaguely, precisely. You can explain the dichotomy of control in a conversation without reaching for notes. You've recommended meditations to people you care about. You've had discussions about Epictetus that went deeper than most people in your life are willing to go. And in certain situations, the ones that aren't too costly, the ones where composure is relatively easy, the ones where the philosophical response and the comfortable response happen to be the same thing, you embody what you've read, and it feels real, because in those moments, it is. But there are other situations, the ones nobody sees. The private irritation you indulge because no one is watching, and the cost of indulging it is low. The shortcut you take because the longer path has no audience, and the effort required to take it would go unwitnessed, and therefore, somewhere beneath conscious reasoning, feels less worth it. The version of yourself that appears only in rooms where your reputation isn't at stake, where there is no one to be composed for, where the philosophical identity you've built has no observer, and therefore, quietly, no enforcement. Most people who encounter this pattern in themselves explain it away quickly, as an off day, as a moment of being human, as evidence that they're not perfect, which is of course true, but which functions in practice as a way of not looking too closely at what's actually happening. What's actually happening is this: The virtue was never fully internalized. It was performed. And performance, however consistent and however genuinely felt in the moment, depends on an audience. Remove the audience, and the performance loses its structure. Not immediately, not completely, but enough to reveal the gap between the philosophical identity and the private behavior. The gap that only you can see and that only you can close. Marcus Aurelius wrote his journal in private. This is the detail that matters most about the meditations and the one that is most consistently underemphasized. He was not writing for posterity. He was not constructing a philosophical legacy. He was not producing content for an audience that would one day find his words meaningful. He was writing notes to himself, in private, about the ways he was failing to live up to the person he intended to be, about the irritations he had indulged, the impatience he had shown, the moments where the automated version of him had appeared instead of the considered one. He did this because he understood something that is easy to understand intellectually and very difficult to live practically. Virtue performed for an audience is not virtue. It is reputation management. And reputation management, however sophisticated and however well-intentioned, is still a form of outsourcing. Still a behavior that depends on external observation to sustain itself. Real virtue, in the Stoic sense, is not the behavior you produce when someone is watching. It is the behavior you produce when no one is. When the cost is real and the witness is absent. When the only person who will ever know what you chose is you. And this is where the question this mistake demands becomes unavoidable. Not as a test of moral purity. The Stoics were not interested in moral purity as an end in itself, but as a diagnostic, a precise instrument for measuring the gap between where you think you are and where you actually are. Would you behave differently if no one would ever know? Not in every situation. Not in the dramatic ones where the stakes are obvious and the choice is clear, but in the small ones, the ordinary Tuesday ones, the ones where a slightly worse version of your behavior would cost you nothing in terms of how others see you, but would cost you something in terms of how you see yourself. If the answer is yes, even occasionally, even in small ways, then the gap is there. And the gap is the work. The practice is simple and uncomfortable in equal measure. Choose one situation this week where no one is watching, and the easier path is available. Not a dramatic situation. Not one where the stakes are high enough that the choice feels obvious. A small one. An ordinary one. One where the harder path requires real effort and produces no external reward whatsoever. Take the harder path, not to prove something to yourself, not to build a story about your own discipline, but simply to close the gap by one repetition. Because the gap doesn't close through understanding it. It doesn't close through acknowledging it. It doesn't close through conversations about Stoic philosophy with people who are impressed by your grasp of the concepts. It closes through behavior, private behavior, repeated behavior, behavior that has no audience except the one that matters most, the version of you that is watching from the inside and keeping an honest account. Virtue is not what you believe. It is not what you can articulate. It is not the identity you've built around a philosophy you genuinely respect and genuinely try to apply. But it is what you do when it costs something and no one is keeping score. Mistake 7. Waiting for the right conditions. There is a version of yourself you have been planning to become. You know this version well. You've thought about it often, probably more often than you'd admit if someone asked. More disciplined, more focused, more present in the moments that matter, less reactive, less scattered. The version that wakes earlier and uses the first hour of the day with intention rather than surrendering it to whatever the phone decides to show. The version that does the hard work first, that holds the line on the commitments made to himself, that moves through difficulty without the familiar pattern of deferral and avoidance. You know exactly who this person is. The image is clear, the intention is genuine, and somewhere in that intention, quietly, without ever being made explicit, a condition has attached itself to the becoming. Not a dramatic condition, not something you've consciously decided, just a circumstance that needs to improve before the real work can begin. A season of life that needs to end. A situation that needs to stabilize. A level of stress that needs to reduce. A particular problem that needs to resolve itself. And then, once it has, once things have settled into something more manageable, the work can start properly. The better version can show up. The real effort can begin. It hasn't been a conscious decision to wait. It has been a series of reasonable postponements, each one individually justifiable, that have accumulated into something that functions exactly like a decision, even though it was never made. And this is the most elegant form of self-deception on this list, because it doesn't look like avoidance. It looks like patience. It looks like pragmatism. It looks like a man who understands his own limits and is being sensible about the timing of his commitments. These are qualities the Stoics valued. Timing matters. Self-knowledge matters. Not overextending matters. But there is a precise point where patience becomes postponement, where pragmatism becomes permission to stay exactly where you are. And that point is much earlier than most people want it to be, because here is what the waiting mind never fully confronts. The conditions are not going to arrange themselves, not in the way you are waiting for them to, not in the specific configuration that would finally make the timing feel right, the ground feel stable, the moment feel appropriate for beginning. This is not pessimism. It is the central Stoic observation about external circumstances, stated clearly, without softening, by virtually every Stoic writer who addressed it. Circumstances are not in your control. They will not organize themselves around your readiness. They will not hold still long enough for you to feel prepared. And the person waiting for them to do so is the person who never begins. Not because they lack the intention, but because the intention has been made conditional on something that was never going to arrive. Marcus Aurelius wrote the Meditations during a plague, during wars that required him to leave Rome for years at a time, during the administrative and personal weight of governing an empire while managing his own health, his grief, his relationships, his philosophical practice. There was no period of his life that would have qualified, by any reasonable standard, as the right conditions. The conditions were always complicated. They were always costly. They were always, in some significant way, not ideal. And yet the work happened, not because the conditions improved, but because he understood something that the waiting mind resists with surprising stubbornness, that the obstacle is not the reason to delay, but it is the occasion. The obstacle, the difficulty, the imperfect circumstance. These are not arguments for postponement. They are the material the work is made of. The discipline built in easy conditions is not discipline. It is comfort operating under a flattering name. Real discipline, the kind that actually changes how a person moves through their life, is built precisely in the conditions that feel least conducive to building it. This is not a call for recklessness, for taking on everything at once in a surge of philosophical resolve that lasts 4 days before collapsing. The Stoics were not interested in intensity. They were interested in consistency. And consistency does not require ideal conditions. It requires the smallest sustainable version of the better behavior, practiced in whatever conditions are actually present. That is the corrective, not the full version of the better self, deployed when circumstances finally cooperate. The smallest version, the one that is available today, in these exact conditions, with this exact level of energy, in this specific season of difficulty or distraction or uncertainty. Identify the condition you are waiting for. Name it precisely, not vaguely, not as a general sense that things need to settle, but the specific circumstance you have been treating as a prerequisite for beginning. Then ask one question. What is the smallest version of the better behavior I could practice today, in these exact conditions, right now? Not the ideal version. Not the version you will produce when the timing is finally right. The version that is possible in this moment, in this life, with these constraints. That version, practiced consistently in imperfect conditions, builds more character than the ideal version practiced never. Because character is not built in the gaps between difficulty, but it is built inside it. In the ordinary moments when the conditions are wrong and the easier path is available, and you choose, without drama and without an audience, to take the harder one anyway. The right conditions are not coming, but the right choice is always available. And it has been available every day you spent waiting for something else to arrive first. Mistake 8. Mistaking intensity for discipline. You have done this before, more than once, possibly more times than you want to count. Something shifts, a conversation that lands differently than expected, a video that articulates something you've been circling for months, a passage in a book that hits with the specific force of a thing you already knew but had never seen, stated so precisely. And suddenly, the motivation is there. Real motivation. The kind that feels different from the usual kind, not the mild background intention to be better that hums along without producing much, but something sharper, more present. The kind that makes the early alarm feel manageable and the difficult work feel possible, and the better version of yourself feel genuinely close. So you move, you restructure the morning, you recommit to the practice, you make the list of changes, and for once the list doesn't feel overwhelming. It feels like a map. For several days, and sometimes several weeks, the better version of yourself shows up with a consistency that feels like evidence, like proof that this time is different. Like the thing that was missing before has finally been found. And then, quietly, it fades. Not dramatically. There is no moment of decision, no conscious choice to stop. Just one morning where the alarm is ignored without much resistance. One evening where the journal stays closed and the reason feels legitimate. One day where the practice doesn't happen and the sky doesn't fall, and the mind registers that fact and files it somewhere useful. And slowly, without a single explicit decision to stop, the pattern dissolves back into the default. The restructured morning reverts. The recommitment fades. The list of changes becomes a record of intentions that didn't hold. And the better version of yourself, which felt so close just a few weeks ago, recedes back to the distance where it usually lives. This is the intensity cycle. And if you have been trying to build any kind of consistent practice, philosophical, physical, creative, professional, you have almost certainly lived this cycle more than once, possibly many times, with enough repetitions that the beginning of a new cycle now carries a faint background awareness of how it is likely to end. What makes this mistake so persistent is not weakness. It is a misunderstanding about what discipline actually is, a misunderstanding that is so widely shared and so deeply embedded in how most people talk about self-improvement that it rarely gets examined. The misunderstanding is this: that discipline is an elevated state, that it is what happens when motivation is high, when clarity is present, when the conditions are right and the intention is strong, that the disciplined person is the one who has found a way to sustain that elevated state, to keep the motivation alive, to maintain the clarity, to hold the intensity without letting it fade. But that is not discipline. That is weather. And weather, by definition, changes. Intensity is real. The motivation that arrives after a powerful conversation or a precise piece of writing is genuine. It is not manufactured or false, but it is temporary. It is a condition, not a capacity. And the person who has confused the two will always be building their practice on a foundation that was never designed to hold weight over time. Epictetus made no room for motivation as a variable, so the practice was the practice regardless of how it felt to perform it. This was not cruelty. It was precision. He understood that a discipline which depends on feeling is not a discipline. It is a preference. And preferences are subject to exactly the same automation that governs every other default behavior. They run when the conditions support them, and they stop when the conditions change. Real discipline looks nothing like the intensity cycle. It is not elevated. It is not particularly motivating. It does not produce the sharp, present feeling of the early days of a new commitment. It is, by almost any experiential measure, considerably less interesting than that. It is the alarm met on an ordinary Wednesday when nothing is pulling you toward it. And the journal opened on a Tuesday evening when the day was unremarkable, and the entry will be unremarkable, and the whole thing will take 12 minutes and feel like exactly 12 minutes. The practice performed without ceremony, without the sense that something important is happening, without the motivation that made it feel easy in the beginning. That version, small, consistent, unglamorous, performed in the absence of any particular feeling about it, is the actual unit of character, not the version produced during the intensity spike. That version is the trailer. The daily version, the one that happens when nothing is pushing you toward it, is the film. And here is what the intensity cycle costs that most people never fully account for. It is not just the lost weeks when the practice isn't happening. It is the accumulating evidence the mind is quietly collecting about who you are. Every cycle that ends the same way, with the practice dissolving back into the default, deposits something in the mind's account of your reliability to yourself. And that account, built up over enough cycles, begins to affect what feels possible, begins to make the beginning of the next cycle carry that faint background awareness of how it is likely to end. The corrective is not a stronger commitment, it is a smaller one. Not the version of the practice you produce when the motivation is high and the conditions are right and the better self feels close. The version you produce when none of those things are true. The smallest sustainable unit, the one that requires so little that the question of whether you feel like doing it becomes almost irrelevant. Because the practice isn't asking much, it is simply asking to happen. That version, performed consistently over months rather than intensely over weeks, builds something the intensity cycle never can. Not just the practice itself, but the evidence. The quiet, accumulating record of a person who showed up when nothing was pulling them toward it. Who did the unremarkable thing on the unremarkable day without requiring a reason beyond the commitment itself. That evidence changes something. Not quickly, not dramatically, but over time, in the way all real change happens in a Stoic life. Gradually, quietly, in a direction you chose, rather than one you fell into. Discipline is not proven in the weeks when the motivation is high and everything aligns, and the better version of yourself feels inevitable. But it is proven in the ordinary Tuesday, when nothing is pulling you toward it, and you do it anyway. Not because it feels important, not because the motivation has returned, but because the practice is the practice. And that, by itself, is reason enough. Mistake 9. Knowing without doing. This is the one that matters most. And if you have been watching this channel for any length of time, if you have spent months or years with Stoic philosophy, reading the texts, returning to the same ideas, building a genuine familiarity with the framework, then this is the one you already knew was coming, the one you recognized before it was named, the one that, if you're honest, has been sitting somewhere in the background of this entire video. Because everything on this list, every mistake, every pattern, every automated response that keeps running without interruption, ultimately leads here, to this, to the gap between the person who understands the philosophy and the person who lives it. And that gap is not a minor inconvenience in a philosophical life. It is the central failure mode. It is the place where the entire project of becoming a better person either moves forward or stalls permanently. Because as long as you can explain the principle clearly, precisely, in a way that impresses the people you explain it to, the mind creates a convincing illusion that the principle is being applied. It isn't. Understanding and application are not on a continuum. They are not 2 points on the same line, where enough understanding eventually becomes application if you accumulate sufficient quantities of it. They are different categories entirely, and the mind that has spent years in the first category can remain completely untouched by the second, can spend a decade reading about the dichotomy of control without ever applying it in a single moment that actually costs something. This is not a failure of intelligence. The people most susceptible to this mistake are often the most intelligent, precisely because intelligence makes the understanding easier to achieve and therefore more convincing as a substitute for the real thing. The person who struggles to grasp the concept has to work harder to get there. The person who grasps it immediately has to work harder to remember that grasping it was never the point. Marcus Aurelius did not write the Meditations because he had mastered Stoicism. This is the most important thing to understand about that text, and the most consistently misread thing about it. He was not recording his wisdom for the benefit of future readers. He was not constructing a philosophical legacy or leaving a map for people who would come after him. He was failing, daily, in small ways and significant ones, losing his patience, indulging his irritations, finding himself reacting when he had intended to respond, performing the composure rather than practicing it, outsourcing his peace to circumstances that had no business determining it, making, in other words, versions of every mistake on this list. Despite being one of the most philosophically educated human beings who has ever lived, despite having thought about these ideas more carefully and more consistently than almost anyone before or since, the journal was not a record of achievement. It was a practice of return, a daily act of recommitting to the person he intended to be, knowing from long experience that the intention alone was never enough, that the gap between knowing and doing does not close through accumulation. It does not close through more reading, more understanding, more precise articulation of the principles involved. It closes through one thing: a single, specific application of a single principle today, in a situation that is actually available to you. Not 9 principles. 1. The one that appeared most in this video. The one you felt the most resistance to as you were watching. The one that, when it came up, produced a slight internal movement, a recognition that was slightly uncomfortable, that you moved past a little more quickly than the others, that you are perhaps moving past again right now. That one. Take it into tomorrow morning, not in a grand sense, not with a restructured routine or a new commitment or a resolve that carries the familiar energy of the intensity cycle beginning again. Just one application, in one real moment, with one real cost, however small, however unglamorous, however unwitnessed by anyone except you. You notice the urge to reach for the phone before the day has properly begun. But you set it down. You feel the pull toward the comfortable account of where you are. But you ask the honest question instead. You sense the replay beginning, the familiar route back to the grievance. But you redirect your attention before it completes. One interruption, one moment, one application of the thing you already know in a situation that actually costs something. That single application is worth more than a year of understanding. Not because understanding is worthless. It is the foundation, and without it, the practice has no architecture. But because understanding without application is not philosophy, it is the beginning of the very automation that keeps you exactly where you are. The mind that knows the principle and doesn't apply it is not a mind in progress. It is a mind that has found a more sophisticated way to stay still. The Stoics were not interested in sophisticated stillness. They were interested in the ordinary, unglamorous daily movement toward the person you are capable of becoming. Not the dramatic version of that movement. Not the version that happens during the intensity spike or the moment of philosophical clarity, or the weeks when everything aligns, and the version that happens on the ordinary morning, when nothing is pulling you toward it. When the automated mind is ready with its familiar instructions, and the philosophical mind has to choose, again, to override them. That choice, made today, in one small moment, with one real cost, is where everything on this list either stays theoretical or becomes real. The mind rewires through repetition, not comprehension. You already know enough. The only question left is what you do with it tomorrow morning. Everything in this video comes back to one thing: the gap between what you know and how you actually move through your days. But here is what most people miss. That gap doesn't close through more knowledge or more willpower. It closes through one specific morning practice, done before the day gets loud, before the automation kicks in, before the weak mind gets its first instruction of the day. In the next video, I break down 9 Stoic lessons that will rewire how your mind opens every morning. Not motivation, not affirmations. A precise sequence that interrupts the default before it starts. If today's video named the mistakes, that one gives you the architecture to stop making them. It's there. Watch it next.